Imagine building one of Europe's biggest financial technology companies, getting praised as Germany's answer to Silicon Valley, joining the country's top stock market index, and then watching the entire empire collapse almost overnight because 1.9 billion euros on the company's balance sheet may have never existed at all. Not stolen, not frozen, not lost, just never there. This is the story of Wirecard, a company that convinced investors, banks, regulators, and much of the media that it was a financial powerhouse, while behind the scenes, the numbers were falling apart. And the craziest part is that people had been warning about Wirecard for years. But instead of stopping the company, Germany went after the people asking questions. So how did Wirecard become one of Europe's biggest fintech stars? And how did it turn into one of the biggest corporate fraud scandals in modern German history? This is the rise and fall of Wirecard. Wirecard was a German payments company. In simple terms, it helped businesses process digital payments. When people bought something online with a card, companies like Wirecard could sit in the middle and help move the money. That might not sound exciting, but in the 2010s, digital payments became a huge business. The world was moving online. More people were shopping on websites, and more companies needed payment systems. Investors loved anything that sounded like the future of finance, and that is exactly where Wirecard positioned itself. It wasn't just selling payment services, it was selling a story that Germany had produced a modern tech champion, a company that could compete with American giants, a company that was fast, global, and innovative. At the center of that story was Wirecard's CEO, Markus Braun. Braun became the face of the company. He dressed like a tech visionary, spoke like a man building the future, and for years, investors bought into the dream. Wirecard grew fast, its stock price soared, and its reputation exploded. Then in 2018, the company reached a major milestone when it entered Germany's prestigious DAX index, replacing Commerzbank. That was a huge moment. Wirecard was no longer just an ambitious fintech company. It was now officially one of Germany's corporate elites. At its peak, the company was worth around 24 billion euros. Investors loved it, the media praised it, and many people saw it as proof that Europe could build a serious fintech giant. But behind the growth story, there were warning signs everywhere. The truth is, Wirecard's story did not suddenly fall apart in 2020. The red flags had been there for years. Critics had questioned the company's accounting, acquisitions, and overseas business operations long before the collapse. One major concern involved Wirecard's profits in Asia. The company claimed that parts of its international business were performing extremely well, but some journalists and researchers started asking a simple question: where exactly was all this money coming from? The more people looked, the stranger things became. There were concerns about complex partnerships, questions about third-party businesses, and doubts about whether some of Wirecard's reported revenues and profits were as real as they seemed. Over time, several reports raised serious allegations. Some claimed that Wirecard's overseas business was being inflated. Others suggested that parts of its accounting simply did not make sense. But instead of collapsing under those accusations, Wirecard fought back hard. The company denied the allegations and pushed the idea that critics were trying to manipulate the stock price. And in a shocking twist, some of the pressure turned not toward Wirecard, but toward the people investigating it. At one point, German regulator BaFin even banned short selling of Wirecard shares. Think about how unusual that is. Instead of the company being treated like the main problem, the people betting against it were treated as suspicious. Journalists from the Financial Times were also put under pressure after publishing investigations into the company. That gave Wirecard something incredibly valuable: time. Time to keep the story alive, time to keep investors believing, and time to keep the machine running. To understand the scandal, you need to understand one thing. Wirecard was not just a simple payments company. Its business was messy, complicated, and spread across many countries. A big part of the controversy involved what were called third-party acquiring partners. These were outside companies that supposedly processed payments for Wirecard in places where Wirecard did not have its own licenses. In theory, that could make sense. But in practice, this structure made Wirecard much harder to understand. And when a business becomes too hard to understand, That can be dangerous, because complexity can hide weakness, or worse, it can hide fraud. Wirecard reported strong profits from parts of this partner business, but critics kept asking whether those profits were genuine. Were these partners real? Were the transaction numbers accurate? Were the profits being exaggerated? For years, those questions never got fully resolved. Instead, Wirecard kept growing and kept insisting that everything was fine. Then came the number that destroyed everything: 1.9 billion euros. That money was supposedly sitting in trustee accounts. In other words, Wirecard claimed that a huge amount of cash existed in bank accounts held on its behalf. This was not a small accounting detail. It was a massive amount of money, roughly a quarter of the company's balance sheet. If that cash was real, Wirecard still had a chance to survive the pressure. But if it wasn't real, the company was in enormous trouble. In June 2020, Wirecard's auditor EY refused to sign off on the company's accounts because it could not confirm the existence of that 1.9 billion euros. That was the turning point. Suddenly, the market had to face a horrifying possibility. What if the money wasn't missing because it had been stolen or frozen? What if it had never existed in the first place? Then things got worse. Banks in the Philippines, which had supposedly held some of the money, said documents connected to those accounts were false. Reports emerged that the cash likely did not exist. Wirecard itself eventually admitted that the 1.9 billion euros was probably not there. Let that sink in. One of Europe's biggest fintech companies had just told the world that billions on its balance sheet might have been imaginary. Not delayed, not trapped, imaginary. At that moment, the story was over. Investors panicked, the stock collapsed, confidence evaporated, and the company that once symbolized German fintech ambition was suddenly fighting for survival. Once the 1.9 billion euro hole was exposed, Wirecard unraveled with incredible speed. Its shares crashed, its lenders panicked, and its reputation was destroyed. Within days, the company filed for insolvency. This was one of the most dramatic corporate collapses in modern Europe. Wirecard went from fintech star to disaster in a matter of days. Creditors were left facing billions in losses, shareholders were crushed, and employees saw the company implode around them. CEO Markus Braun resigned and was later arrested. Another key executive, Jan Marsalek, disappeared, and that is one of the strangest parts of the entire story. Marsalek did not just leave the company, he vanished. Reports later suggested he had fled and become an international fugitive. So now the scandal had everything: fake cash, missing billions, regulatory failure, and an executive who simply disappeared. It sounded less like a normal business failure and more like the plot of a financial thriller. This is the question that makes the Wirecard story so powerful. How did this happen? How did a public company worth billions, operating in plain sight, fool so many people for so long? The answer is not simple, because Wirecard was not just a story about one dishonest company. It was also a story about the system around it. A story about how institutions can fail when they want to believe a success story. There were several layers to that failure. First, there was the power of complexity. Wirecard's business was hard to understand. It operated across borders, used outside partners, and produced numbers that were difficult for outsiders to verify. That complexity created cover. Second, there was the power of growth. Investors love growth stories, and Wirecard gave them exactly what they wanted: a European fintech star, a digital payments company in a booming market, a charismatic CEO, and a fast-rising stock. People wanted the story to be true, and when people want something to be true, they often ignore warning signs. Third, there was a failure of oversight. Questions were raised for years, but the company kept moving forward. Auditors, regulators, and parts of the market failed to stop the problem before it became catastrophic. In fact, one of the most disturbing parts of the scandal is that some critics appeared to face more pressure than the company itself. That sent a terrible message. It made the truth harder to expose, and it gave Wirecard more room to survive until it couldn't. Wirecard is not just another failed company story. It matters because of what it revealed. It showed how fragile trust can be in finance. A payments company does not sell shoes, phones, or food. It sells trust. It sells the promise that money is where the company says it is, that transactions are real, and that the numbers can be believed. And when that trust breaks, everything breaks with it. Wirecard also exposed serious weaknesses in Germany's financial oversight system. The scandal damaged the credibility of regulators, embarrassed auditors, and became one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in the country's post-war history. Even years later, the fallout is still being felt. Executives have faced criminal proceedings, investigations have continued, and the scandal remains a warning sign for investors around the world. Because Wirecard proved that a company can look polished, successful, and unstoppable on the surface, while something very different is happening underneath. The real lesson of Wirecard is not just that fraud is bad. That part is obvious. The deeper lesson is this: sometimes the most dangerous companies are not the ones that look weak. They are the ones that look unstoppable. The ones with the perfect story, the perfect branding, and the perfect growth narrative. The kind of company that makes people feel stupid for asking hard questions. Wirecard had that aura. It looked like the future, and for a while, that image protected it. But numbers do not care about branding forever. Eventually, reality shows up. And in Wirecard's case, reality arrived in the form of a missing 1.9 billion euros that may never have existed at all. That one number destroyed the entire illusion. A company worth billions. A national success story. A fintech empire. Gone. Wirecard was supposed to represent the future of European finance. Instead, it became a symbol of something else. How easy it is for hype, complexity, and weak oversight to create a perfect environment for disaster. A company trusted by investors, celebrated by the market, protected by prestige, and built around numbers that the world eventually stopped believing. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe to Money Trap for more stories about corporate fraud, startup collapses, and billion-dollar business disasters. Because in business, the biggest success stories sometimes hide the biggest lies.